Good evening, everyone. This is the MedExcel USMLE, and in this portion, we are actually covering the USMLE Step 1 components. And welcome to the Neuroanatomy. This is the brainstem Part 1, and we have a long haul in front of us because this is a very long topic and it contains a lot of high yield topics that we want to discuss further. So the learning objective, first of all, that's what we're going to look at. The first learning objective is that we're going to learn the major components of the brainstem. We will also go through the internal organization of the brainstem along with the origination of the cranial nerve nuclei. This is important because 10 out of 12 cranial nerve nuclei, they come from the brainstem. Also, we're going to look at the anterior and the posterior surface of the brainstem. Among this, posterior surface is the high yield topic. We will also go through with the reticular formation of the brainstem. So buckle yourself because we are going to learn a lot here. First of all, let's go through the introduction on the brainstem. So the brainstem is a stalk-like structure which connects the cerebrum above, right here, and it also connects with the spinal cord right there. So the brainstem is basically present right there, and it contains three different areas, and we will discuss them later in different presentations that include the midbrain. We have pons and medulla. Brainstem will serve as a relay station for motor, sensory, and the autonomic information, and it contains the nerves, pathways, and reflex centers. So it's like the relay point where everything goes in and then goes out to where they belongs to, and they can also bring back the signals from the other side and relay back. So everything goes through here, so it controls everything right there. Then we have a critical functions that go through the brainstem, and that is the control of the cardiovascular, respiratory, consciousness, and the sleep-wake cycle. Where is it located? So the brainstem is located in the posterior cranial fossa and is present on the dorsal aspect of the clivus. So remember this. In the normal patients, there should be the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid between clivus and the brainstem, and the fourth ventricle is posterior to the brainstem, and the fourth ventricle is present between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So that is important. There are three divisions of the brainstem, as we discussed that before: midbrain, pons, and medulla. So starting from superior to inferior, we have midbrain, then we have pons, and then we go down to medulla oblongata. Let's start with these individually. Let's start with the midbrain. That is the most superior one, the superiormost portion of the brainstem, and it will connect the diencephalon to the pons. And it is divided into ventral tegmentum and dorsal tectum. Just remember the names. And it includes the vital structures like cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4 nuclei. It will also house the reticular formation. It will house the extrapyramidal structures and the cerebral aqueduct, which branches of, the midbrain is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So any occlusion in the posterior cerebral artery, and if you see that on the MRI or anywhere else, just think that the midbrain could be affected, and you will see the palsies of the cranial nerve 3 and 4 if the branches supplying to those were affected as well. Let's start with pons. So pons is in the midway point. So you have the midbrain, then come the pons. So it will connect the midbrain superiorly with the medulla oblongata inferiorly, and it has the important structures like cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. The blood supply through the pons is through the basilar artery and the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, or ICA, that will supply the blood to the pons. The third one is the medulla oblongata. That is the inferior most portion of the brainstem, and it will connect the central nervous system essentially to the spinal cord. And it will occur at the level of the foramen magnum. So there are three vital centers located in the medulla, One of them is the cardiac centers, then we have the medullary rhythmicity centers, and then we have the vasomotor centers. So when we go down to medulla oblongata, we will discuss those in details. Now coming down to the cranial nerve, we have cranial nerve number 9, 10, 11, and 12. 10 is vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is one of the most important cranial nerve in the entire body. The blood is supplied through the branches of anterior spinal artery, vertebral artery, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or pica. Remember this. So most of the pathologies that can be attributed to brainstem can either come from ICA, anterior inferior, or posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now let's look at the different layers, or let's focus on the laminae or layer in the brainstem. The very first one is the tectum, and it consists of the quadrigeminal plate and the medullary velum, and it is responsible for the auditory and the visual reflexes. The second layer is tegmentum, and it is the middle layer, and it is the site of the cranial nerve nuclei somatotopic organization. Third layer is the basis, and it is the most anterior part and consists of the routes of the major motor pathways. Now we are going to come to this major topic where we are looking at the cranial nerve nuclei. So as I discussed before, the 10 out of 12 cranial nerves originates from the brainstem. Cranial nerve 1 and 2 does not originate from the brainstem, so you need to remember that. First two, 1 and 2, do not come from the brainstem. 3 to 12 come from the brainstem, and this is one of the way that you can remember this. The cranial nerve rules that remember this, and it's very easy to remember through this way. The rule of 4, and it's a high yield, as you can see. There are 4 cranial nerve that originates above pons. There are 4 cranial nerve that will come out of pons or originate from pons, and there are 4 cranial nerves that will originate from medulla. And there are 4 cranial nuclei that are present medially. So rule of 4. As you can see, this is cranial nerve number 2. So optic nerve, we rule out that one. So we have 3 and 4 coming out of midbrain. We have 5, 6, 7, and 8 coming out of pons. You can see that midbrain, pons, and medulla. And then we have the number 9, that is glossopharyngeal, vagus, hypoglossal, and spinal accessory nerve. That comes through medulla. Moving on, cranial nerve nuclei are present in the tegmentum portion of the brainstem, which is between the dorsal and the ventral portion. So in the midbrain, as we see on the previous slide, we have cranial nerve number 3 and 4. On the pons, we have 5, 6, 7, and 8. And in medulla, we have 9, 10, 11, and 12. So spinal cord actually, it contains the nucleus of the cranial nerve number 11. So sometimes this thing used is interchangeable, that it is a cranial nerve, but the nucleus is present in the spinal cord. We have the lateral nuclei. They are sensory in nature and present in the alar plate, sulcus, limitans, and then we have the medial nuclei present in the brainstem, and they are motor in nature, present in the basal plate. Now let's look at the surfaces. As we discussed before, we're going to look at the surfaces of the brainstem. So starting with the anterior surface, it is important, but high yield is coming from the posterior surface. So you can give some attention to this one, but you will also need to focus more on the posterior surfaces of the brainstem. So number 1, anterior surface of the brainstem contains some very important structures. First of all, cranial nerve nuclei. So 3 to 12 can be appreciated in this area, and depending on the area, that is to say midbrain, pons, and medullary division on the anterior surface. So you can find most of the cranial nerve, or you can appreciate most of the cranial nerve in the anterior surface of brainstem. The second important structure is the crus cerebri. It is a major pathway comprised of the descending fibers of the motor output. So here's another thing that you can remember. Anything going up is sensory, and most of the time it is present laterally, and anything coming out is motor, and most of the time it is present medially. So if you have this basic understanding of the central nervous system, half of your problems are done basically. So they originate in the cortex and they run inferiorly through the brainstem and will continue in the spinal cord through the corticospinal tract. We have discussed that in the spinal cord or in the previous lectures, that the name of the pathways goes where it is originating and where it is going. So motor pathway is usually corticospinal, starting from the cortex going into the spinal tract or spinal cord, so it's a corticospinal tract. It is also known as the cerebral peduncles. Now let's look at pons, anterior surface. There are different structures that are present in the pons division at the anterior surface. First of all, we have the cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, 8. Then we have corticospinal and corticobulbar motor fibers. Pontocerebellar fibers are present. So ponto, starting with pons and going into cerebellum. So pontocerebellar fibers are present there. Then we have the medial lemniscus, and they are the second order neuron of the DCML system. If you remember, we have the first and the second and sometimes the third. So this is the second order neuron in the medial lemniscus. We will also have a medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is a nerve bundle in the brainstem that coordinate eye movements and the head position reflex. And in the surface, we can also appreciate the pontine centers for the lateral gaze and the reticular formation. And now we're going to focus on the medullary division on the anterior surface. First structure is the olive, and it is much better appreciated on the anterior surface in the medulla. Then we have the olive and olivary bodies or olivary nuclei, and they are present in the lateral aspect of the medulla. What do? They participate in the sound localization and analysis, acting as a relay between cochlear nuclei and the inferior colliculi in the auditory pathway. You will see the inferior colliculi in the later slides. We have the medullary pyramids. The corticospinal tract descends from here, and they are the motor fibers and tracts. Again, cortex, spinal cord, corticospinal tract, motor, coming from the central nervous system going down. 90% of the fiber decussate here. So in the medullary region, most of the corticospinal tract, they decussate. We have discussed that in the spinal cord presentations. And then we have 10% that stays on the same side. That means that 10% stays ipsilaterally. The other 90% goes on the other side, like it passes through the 10th division in the middle of the spinal cord, go to the other side and go contralateral. Well, we are here on the posterior surface. We have quite a build-up here. So there are multiple important structures present on the posterior surface of the brainstem. High-yield topic, remember, superior colliculi. It is involved in the orientation of the head and eyes to the visual stimuli. And then we have the inferior colliculi, and it is involved in the orientation of the head and ears to the auditory stimuli. Remember, it's this way. Eyes are present above the ears. So superior is present above the inferior. Very easy to remember. So if you look at here, superior colliculus is present right here, inferior is present right there. So these two areas. So if you look at, if eyes are above there, they're going to come there, and if the ears are present here, they're going to go there. So the reflex goes accordingly. Then we have the trochlear nerve. Let's start with that. So it is the only cranial nerve that originates from the posterior surface of the brainstem, and it supplies the superior oblique muscles. We have already discussed that in the cranial nerve presentation, so please review those. Another system or another structure that is present here is the pineal gland. So pineal gland is important. It has a role in the circadian rhythm that controls our sleep-wake cycle, and it is also involved in the melatonin secretion. Remember that. If you want to see that on the diagram here, pineal body is present right there. This is pineal. More to the posterior surface, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle, we have a middle cerebellar peduncle, and we have the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So if you can see here, cerebellum is connected to the brainstem. We have the superior, we have the middle, and we have the inferior peduncles, and they connects with the the different divisions. So superior connects with midbrain, middle with pons, inferior with medulla. So superior cerebellar peduncle. It is a principal motor output of the cerebellum to coordinate ipsilateral arms and legs. Middle cerebellar peduncle, largest of all three, and it primarily conveys efferents from the pontine nuclei. And then we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and it provides efferents from medulla and efferents to the vestibular nuclei. Further into the posterior surface, we have the floor of the fourth ventricle. So floor of the fourth ventricle is present right there. Then we have the cuneatus structure. So these provide the fine touch, remember the functions, fine touch, 2-point discrimination, pressure vibrations, and conscious proprioception from the ipsilateral upper extremity. And they consist of tuberculum, lower extremity, cuneatus, and the fasciculus cuneatus. So tuberculum cuneatus is for the lower extremity, fasciculus cuneatus for the upper extremity. Then we have the gracilis structures, and these provide again fine touch, 2-point discrimination, pressure vibration, and conscious proprioception from ipsilateral lower extremity, and they consist of tuberculum lower extremity and fasciculus upper extremity. Tuberculum, gracilis, and fasciculus. Now we're going to look at the reticular formation. It is one of the important topics to remember. So the reticular formation consists of a network of neurons in the brainstem that integrates and relay information to and from the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So if you can see here, you see two arrows. One is yellow color, the other one is the green color. So, and you also see the eye. It is also relaying some information here. But you see most of the information is going up, and then it will go to the appropriate area where it's needed to go, and then it comes down. So reticular formation is a set of interconnected nuclei and composed of two different components. As I said that before, that brainstem acts as a relay station, so reticular formation makes it possible. So two different components are interconnected nuclei. So let's start. Midbrain has a dorsal tegmental nuclei, pons has a central tegmental nuclei, medulla is the inferior nuclei. Remember this, midbrain is present superior most, so you can connect it with the dorsal most. Pons is present in the center or in the middle between midbrain and medulla, so it has a central tegmental nuclei, so remember that, a small trick. And the last one is the medulla. Medulla is the inferior most, so the inferior nuclei. And it has two components. One of them is the ascending reticular formation, reticular activating system. It makes the part of the reticular activating system. And the second one is the descending reticular formation. Let's start with the internal organization of the reticular formation. Number one, it has basically three different columns. So if you see, if this is the brainstem going like this, so it has a median, then it has a medial, and it has a lateral one. So that's how you can remember this. So starting with the median column of the reticular nuclei, it extends through medulla, pons, and midbrain. So all three structures, and collectively these are called the raphe nuclei. So you see the raphe nucleus right here. So these are the parts. So this red one that you see in the middle, that's what it all makes. And the major function is that it produces serotonin. Now let's move to the medial column of the reticular formation. It consists of the medium and a very large gigantocellular or magnocellular nuclei. So it innervates the cranial nerve nucleus at number 12 nuclei and responds to the glutamatergic stimuli. The key role for this medial column is motor control and contribute to the reticulospinal tract, which influences spinal cord activity. And the last one is the lateral column of the reticular nuclei. So the lateral column is, of course, to the very side or very end of the all three columns. So it consists of these 6 nuclear groups known as the parvocellular nuclei, and it is involved in the inspiratory portion of respiration. So now here's the functions. It integrates the information from the spinal cord to help control the motor behaviors like posture, reaching, and grasping. It also regulates the cardiovascular functions, nociception, and circadian rhythms. Then we have the modulation of the stress responses, including attention, arousals, and vigilance. So lateral column is one of the important part in the brainstem. We have reached to the last slide of the brainstem, and these are basically some fundamental landmarks of the brainstem. And in the coming presentations, I have divided all three in different areas. I have made another presentation on midbrain, then we have one on pons, and then we have one on medulla oblongata. And in these divisions, we are going to look at these different structures in these areas, and we are going to look at the clinical pearls or clinical cases that is pertaining to the USMLE Step 1 exam. Thank you so much for joining in this presentation, and I will see you in the next one.